So everybody that's listening, if you're listening to us on the radio, we thank you so much. Please keep doing that. If you're listening to us on one of the podcasting sites, I mean, I hope this gets on YouTube, but half of the course it probably won't because they censor everything in the kitchen sink. But if you're listening to us on YouTube, Rumble, Spotify, the list goes on and on. Thanks so much. Like, subscribe, share this interview. And we have a special guest on here. I saw him on Dr. Campbell, who I watched very much a lot because, he's one of the few doctors that are really giving the truth about what's going on in COVID-19 still to this day, and issues with, we have to be careful how we say this, James, with the medical issue that happened during COVID-19 where people have got injured due to that medical procedure. We have James Roguski here on Fire Breathing Rob. James is a wizard on what's going on with the WHO. You may know this, you may not. We are trying to bring James on to educate the listeners and the viewers about what's going on in May, because this is not just happening this year. This has been going on since 2022. And James will educate us all on what's going on with the WHO. James, first of all, thanks so much for bringing this information to the public as much as you have in the past few weeks, months.
Well, thanks for having me. And things are actually happening, that are very important next week and the 2 weeks after that. So one of the things that I have been talking about recently, people talk about misinformation, disinformation, malinformation. I've identified another problem, and that's old information. So, if you think about your favorite baseball team, basketball, football, soccer, hockey, whatever, if you were talking about them 6 months ago and they were doing a lousy job, they're in last place, totally not doing well. But then 6 months later, they figured it out. They're doing better. Now they're in first place. You could say they're in last place. You could say they're in first place. But the time difference matters. Things change. And so what's been going on with the WHO is over the course of 2 years in these negotiations, the original documents that were made available are old news. And unfortunately, the vast majority of people in the media are not adapting to new information. So you can be right about something that's old and be very, very wrong about what's current. And hopefully we can clarify some of that. I hope that concept gets across. Time, passes and things change, and you have to adapt to the new information.
So, just to educate a lot of the people that are listening to this, wherever they are around the country or even around the world, what is the WHO? Because a lot of people hear, the FBI, the CIA, the CDC, all these three-letter, organizations, and they really don't, know what's going on inside these organizations. They really can't grasp it. So, can you give the audience a little bit of a synopsis on what the WHO is?
Well, that's not an easy question because the answer, again, depends on how you want to look at it. What is the WHO supposed to be? What is it that they have become? And my joke is that WHO does not stand for World Health Organization, stands for World Hypnosis Organization, because they don't have any authority. They have a bully pulpit on a certain level. They say they recommend this, they recommend that. And as it filters down, just like anything else in life, I've witnessed this firsthand. You say something to someone, and then you listen to them repeat it to the next person, and you're like, hold on a minute, that's not the same story. How did that get changed so quickly? So if you go all the way back to 1948, on June 14th of 1948, President Truman signed not a treaty, he signed a joint resolution of Congress that essentially said, yeah, we'll join the WHO. Most people don't realize that the WHO has a constitution. So we essentially accepted their constitution. But there were a couple of caveats in that agreement. And the most important of which, I think, said, yeah, we're joining. We'll have to help the world, improve sanitation and health around the world. but nothing that the WHO ever says would require the United States to do anything. So it's supposed to be an advisory body where, if they can help other nations who request it, wonderful, happy to help out. Well, about 20 years ago or so, the WHO was not happy with how much money the countries were willing to give to them because they messed up, a number of things through the years. And so they changed how they got financed. And so only in 2022, maybe 16% of their budget came from the nations that make up the WHO, and 80+% came from donations. Additional money from the nations and various organizations, Bill and Melinda Gates, Rockefeller Foundation, all that sort of thing. But that additional donated money comes with strings attached. Oh, we'll give you plenty of money, but here's what we want you to do with it. Well, that quite frankly, that's the turd in the punch bowl. I mean, that just messed up the whole works because they're not actually seeking to improve the health of people. They're doing the bidding. Who pays the piper calls the tune. And so all of the donors, including money from nations like the United States, in 2022, we gave them additional $750 million. Well, that usually finds its way back into the pockets of big pharma. Their solution seems to be there's got to be some drug or some jab that they can stick in somebody, and it turns a profit for the organizations that are invested in those industries. And it's a conflict of interest that is built into the current version of the WHO. I don't see any way around just exiting. When a relationship has gone as sour as this, sometimes, people need to get divorced. Sometimes you need to exit the WHO.
Well, we saw what happened with Bill Gates during COVID. He was highly invested in the shots, bought a lot of stock in the companies that were developing these shots. And then all of a sudden, a year or so later, he came out and said, well, the shots didn't work. We need to have some kind of nasal shot. Maybe we need to think of shots in a different way and not injections, but maybe having it in food. I mean, the list goes on and on. And then he also dropped out of the stocks. He pulled out all his money from those. So we can even just look at that and see that tells a big story of what's going on with Bill Gates. I also want to talk about. Go ahead. I'm sorry, James.
I'm not a financial analyst or a financial advisor, but does the phrase "pump and dump" mean anything to you? Right. Talk up the stock, after you've bought it low, and then sell it and talk it back down, and make money in both directions.
Yeah, no, you're 100% right. Just to go back, because when President Trump was president, obviously he talked a lot about these three-letter agencies in the United States, but even, about the WHO. We heard him talk about the UN. The list goes on and on of getting out of these, or even asking other countries to invest more. That was more towards the UN. He talked about getting out of the WHO and withdrawing from it.
They did a little bit more than talking. I forget if it was June or July, but in that time period in 2020, he had Secretary of State Pompeo write a letter to the WHO. One of the other sections of the 1948 law said very clearly that if we ever want to leave the WHO, we'll give them written notice, give them a year advance notice, and pay any money that we're obligated to pay based on what we told them, we would do. But then we're out of there. Well, the problem was he only had about 6 months left in his term. And one of the very first things that Biden did when he took office was undo the year-long process that had only gone halfway through. So, maybe he had the right idea, but it just didn't happen. He has stated very clearly, Trump has, that not only would he cancel or reject the proposed amendments to the existing regulations or any new pandemic agreement, he would exit the WHO and work to abolish them. And I would have to agree with that sentiment. I think that is exactly what needs to be done.
Well, I know a lot of people that listen to this show, whether it's listening or watching this, are injured from the medical. I laugh, but people
They're
listening and
enjoying
watching
they're
this.
enjoying some adverse events from the
Right.
medical countermeasure that was designed to end the problems that everyone was having, not necessarily replace them with a whole slew of others.
Right. Thank you, James, for clarifying that for myself and the audience. But for those people, whoever it is, whether it's Kennedy or Trump, do hope that they do leave this organization in general because it's been detrimental to the country in general. And I wanted you to talk about what's going on with the ratifying these amendments. I'm my talk is all gobbledygook. This backwards and forwards. So if you can kind of educate what is going on with this treaty, the amendments, the ratification process, everything in the kitchen sink for people, and have as much time as you want, James.
Well, I'll try to keep this as brief and tight as possible because number one, uh, all of the local tyrants who either tried or did abuse your rights and freedoms over the last 4.5 years, they did not need any amendments to the international health regulations, and they did not need a new pandemic treaty. They were perfectly capable of exceeding their authority and hypnotizing or using some kind of psychological games on people to coerce them, whether it was monetary or any other thing. All of those problems that people might be concerned about, mandates, the different drugs and jabs that people, were coerced into taking, those problems are local. Whether your doctor was allowed to give you good advice or was hamstrung by the organization that they are licensed by or the hospital or clinic that they work for, those problems didn't require any input from the WHO. And unless laws have been changed and people have examined, how that all happened, they're just already willing and able to do that all over again to you. In some jurisdictions, laws have been passed that make it even worse, give more powers and just, a dystopian view of what should be done when someone says, oh, there's an emergency somewhere. Okay. So people need to understand that those local issues are still with you. The person or groups that may have attempted to abuse your rights and freedoms in any way, they're all ready to do it all over again. They could probably teach the WHO a thing or two about how to infringe upon your rights and freedoms. What's going on with the amendments to the international health regulations, unfortunately, has been overridden by old news. Okay. This process has been going on for more than a year. The originally proposed amendments were submitted on September 30th, 2022. They kept them secret until December of 2022. And I'm going to venture to guess that I'm the only one involved with, this podcast, radio show that has actually read the amendments and has read the International Health Regulation Review Committee report on those amendments. So this is where everybody gets it mixed up. It's not the WHO saying, ooh, we want to take over the world. It was 94 nations who submitted 197 pages of amendments, over 300 amendments, to an 84-page document. Okay, they're talking about making some changes. And the review committee looked at what the nations had proposed and in many ways put the kibosh on a lot of it back on February 6th, 2023. They said, well, India, you can't do that. And Bangladesh, boy, if you do that, that's going to change everything. And, the regulations, we can't really put money in there to fund, your health industry. You got to rearrange this because it's just not how that's going to work. Well, unfortunately, most people didn't get the memo. And so a lot of what was proposed has been dead in the water for over a year. But people are talking about that as if it is still what is going on in these negotiations. About 5.5 weeks or so, I think it's getting to be 6 weeks now, I got lucky. I was looking for something else and I found on Geneva. They refer to themselves as um, a civil society organization, foundation, group, whatever. And they had access to the most recent version of the proposed amendments, which had been kept secret, this whole time. So I published that about 6 weeks ago, and I might as well have dropped it into a black hole. Nobody wants to look at the new information. Well, there's a couple of scary things in my view in that new version, most of which centers around giving the Director General of the WHO the authority to not only do what he currently has the authority to do, which is to declare a public health emergency of international concern. PHEIC, Public Health Emergency of International Concern, or FAKE. They also want to add the ability to declare an early action alert, which I call a pre-fake, and a more severe thing, which they call a pandemic emergency, which I call a post-fake. The problem is he just gets to declare it. There's no vote, there's no, commission or board, or the World Health Assembly doesn't get to come in a week later and go, hey, what the heck are you doing? It's just totalitarian dictatorial powers to scare people. Now, maybe there is a problem, and maybe resources need to be redirected, to help nations wherever it may be. But giving the authority to make that declaration, which allows the hypnosis and the propaganda and the psychological operations to kick into gear, is, I think, very unwise. And you can go all the way back to the Roman Empire. That's where the term dictator comes from. If there was an emergency and someone was put in the position to dictate orders, you do this and you do this and you do this, the definition of a dictator kind of sort of requires a state of emergency. They would love to have us in a constant state of emergency. And in addition to that, in the amendments, they want to strengthen what I think is already an abominable article in the international health regulations. It's been there since 2005. Article 31 would have an impact, or does have an impact, on anyone who is traveling to another country. If you leave wherever you may be and you land in another country on an airplane, a boat, a train, a bus, or they refer to that as a conveyance. When you're outside your country visiting that foreign nation, legal travel, they have all agreed amongst themselves. This is not the WHO mandating it. This is all of the nations saying, well, when your people come to our country, we can do whatever we want to them. And when our people go to your country, you can do whatever you want in terms of invasive examinations, prophylaxis or preventative treatments, vaccines, isolation, quarantine. You're at the mercy of the officials wherever you go. And they're trying to strengthen that. My take on it is that's the last thing in the world. You're changing that in the wrong direction, because here's where we're going to get in trouble with YouTube. So I'll say it in a very specific way. If you're mandating something, it probably ought to work. And, I don't really know what an asymptomatic ailment is. To me, that's what health is. You don't have any symptoms, right? So putting the WHO in charge of determining what kind of diagnostic and what kind of injections, are authorized to be forced upon international travelers doesn't sound like the right direction to me. Now, the third thing is what most people call the pandemic treaty. That word is a hot spot for people's minds because in United States common practice, something isn't called a treaty officially until it's gone through the entire constitutional process of being negotiated. The Senate gives its consent, The president ratifies it by depositing it wherever they're supposed to, signing and depositing it. After that process has completed, then the United States common use of the word is they call that a treaty. You might say this is potentially a treaty, but to call it a treaty is not right. The WHO from the get-go has said that they want it to be a framework convention. Now, if I say framework convention for climate change, it should send a shiver down your spine. That was agreed to and consented by the Senate in 1992. And year after year after year, a bunch of unelected bureaucrats go have a party somewhere, and they come together in the conference of the parties and make decisions that, since all of the nations associated with the United Nations agreed to the framework, whatever these jokers decide to add to the framework, we're obligated to do. So, if you like how the Framework Convention for Climate Change has been operating, maybe you'll really like to have a framework convention for pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response. But let me just take a brief couple of minutes to explain what this treaty is including. They would like to spend up to $30 billion a year. Now, remember, the WHO budget is only about $4 billion a year. So they want 7 or 8 times as much to go looking for pathogens with pandemic potential, bring them into a WHO coordinated laboratory network.
So can I
Because
just interject quickly? So this is gain of function then, correct?
no, I didn't say gain of function yet. What we're talking about is
Okay.
looking for pathogens with pandemic potential, which usually pathogens are found in excrement. Okay, so they're surveilling wastewater treatment, sewage
Okay.
systems, septic systems, farm animals, your pig pen, your chicken coop,
Right.
your horse barn, your horse stable and cow barn, or sheep and goats or whatever. You got to dig into the chicken coop to find the bird flu. You got to dig into the guano in the bat cave to find, the coronavirus or whatever. Hospitals, your veterinarian's office, when you give over a stool sample, somebody sticks a swab up someone else's nose, however you might try to look for a pathogen that has potential. Now, I look at that phrase and what I hear is pathogen with pandemic profiteering potential. Because
Right.
if you go back to the very beginning with the Wuhan Institute of Virology 1 genetic sequence, that's just a small data file, right? Here's the genetic sequence. How much money was that data file ultimately worth? A couple of $100 billion, maybe a couple $1 trillion? This is the new gold rush. Go find what, a pathogen that they can say is disease X, and turn that into products that can be used to treat the disease that you went looking for. Classic Hegelian dialectic. Create a problem, show up with the solution, and have a monstrous fund of money to have contracts be dished out to buy the products and then give them to people. Oh, it's free. We're here to save you, because, they got paid way more than they should have for solution to a problem that they're trying to create on a regular basis. They want to bring that genetic information and those pathological or pathogen samples into what they call the pathogen access and benefit sharing system. If they share the pathogen, if they give access to the pathogen to the pharmaceutical companies to turn it into drugs and jabs, they want to make sure that they get a piece of the pie. Because when South Africa and Botswana found Omicron and handed it over like they thought they were obligated to do, they didn't get a piece of the billions of dollars that Pfizer and Moderna made when they put it into the booster. And they're not having that. We're not giving, from their point of view, they're not giving up their sovereign biological resources. That's part of the definition of sovereignty in the agreement. They're not going to give over that valuable information unless they're guaranteed a piece of the pie. And so the negotiations are really snagged on that exact agreement because the pharmaceutical company doesn't want to give up their profits, and the nations don't want to give up their pathogens. Well, the bigger problem is the United States is already busy doing that. In 2022, the National Defense Authorization Act was passed in December, and it allocated through the Defense Department $5 billion over the next 5 years to build out these laboratory networks and this, genetic sequencing and all that sort of thing. It's essentially biological weapons research, development, production, and proliferation. And so all of this is going on under the facade of trying to prevent the next pandemic. So if you think having a Wuhan Institute of Virology on every street corner and going out looking for pathogens, I mean, literally the CDC, if you search CDC wastewater surveillance, they're busy, taking samples out of wastewater in sewers all over the country. Airplanes that come from foreign nations, they check the water that comes out of the bathrooms.
Oh, wow.
They're looking for the next problem. It's not necessarily the case that, oh, somebody is really, really sick, what's bothering them? They're looking for pathogens with potential. And, it's a money-making venture that I call the new OPEC. OPEC stands for oil producing and exporting countries, but this is really the Organization of Pandemic Emergency Corporations. The lesson that they learned from the last 4.5 years is if you can scare the bejeebers out of people, they'll scream for government to put a bunch of money into it,
Right.
so that the government gives the money to big pharma and then gives away, these wonderful treatments for free. And it's a very profitable venture. They learned that they could turn an enormous profit. They don't need to test anything. They don't need to prove anything. They're not liable for any problems. If this was on Shark Tank, or, you're writing up a dissertation or a paper in business school, people would throw you out thinking you're crazy. You're not going to get government to put billions of dollars into an untested product. But apparently, that program worked pretty good over the last 4 years. They're just trying to export it to the nations that did 10 to 20 times better without all of that. African nations who
Yeah.
didn't gain access to all of this did significantly better than the
Right.
Western nations who had all of this high-tech stuff. So the reality is, this is not what people think it is. Um, the concern about your rights and freedoms is primarily local. If you view international travel from the perspective of, they actually want to stop travel. They want to have some excuse to get everyone locked down. And if they could get each nation to abuse the rights and freedoms of visitors, that's actually constitutional, because it's not abusing the rights of the citizens in the country. It's foreign citizens who don't have any rights really when they're traveling. If you think of Novak Djokovic, the tennis player, he wasn't allowed to participate in some of the tennis tournaments because he wasn't jabbed, but also because he wasn't a citizen. And then, the quote unquote treaty is constitutional, because if you look up Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3, that's the Commerce Clause. This is essentially a trade agreement. They're talking about, how much to pay for pathogens and who gets which products and where you're going to have a distribution hub and deal with the logistics. That is part of the federal government's 18 enumerated authorities. They have the right under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3 to regulate international commerce with foreign nations. Now, everybody's getting this all jumbled up and saying, oh, the treaty is about everything under the sun. And the treaty is bad, it's crazy, it's ridiculous. But what is happening is many people are cross-pollinating all of these many different documents and older ones and other issues. And so, it's on the verge of collapsing because the greedy big pharma doesn't want to give away any pieces of the pie to greedy little pharma in all the other nations around the world. So, hopefully, they're not going to reach an agreement. But, step number one is just to get clear on what the heck is really going on. So, on my Substack a couple of days ago, I published an article, Get Your Facts Straight. And if you just go to jamesroguski.substack.com, look for the article from a couple of days ago, Get Your Facts Straight. I did a much longer interview. I think that's one of the ones that you saw with Dr. John Campbell, but all of the documents are there. I've tried to summarize them. Local issues still have to be dealt with locally. The amendments, why would you want one person to be able to scare the daylights out of everybody by always saying there's an emergency? The sky is falling, or, crying wolf all the time. In order to drum up business, that the treaty would take money from poor people in rich nations through taxes or debt, hand it over to this fund where all of the WHO cronies could dish out contracts to, littler, smaller oligarchs around the world. They want to build more manufacturing capacity to make these wonderful injections that are doing everyone so much good. What in the world are they thinking? Well, I don't think they're thinking about your health. I think they're thinking about their wealth. And once people take a look at this, I think they get it immediately. But you're not going to hear it on the mainstream media. You're not going to, get properly informed in the alternative media. They're talking about old news. So it's a battle. But if you recall, I don't know if you do, a decade or so ago, there was a Trans-Pacific Partnership
Yeah.
that Hillary Clinton
Hillary
had
Clinton. Yeah.
helped negotiate, and then Obama signed it. And it was already a done deal before anybody ever really found out about it. But we, the people, made such a stink about it that nobody in government would support it because they knew that everybody was against it. And we need to get this to be that same type of toxic idea. Why in the world would we want to pay billions of dollars so that the WHO can operate this, I think, organized crime operation to go looking for pathogens, to bring them into laboratories, to make more drugs and jabs to scare people into taking? That's kind of how we got into this problem now, isn't it?